C64K Retro Gaming Goodness.
Hey, Bastish B here for 64K and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So if you've never watched this show before, the premise is I take a look at a new game on an old retro system, and then we have a look at the inspiration game, the game that might have inspired it. And today's games are... So let's first check out the original. Scramble was released by Konami in the arcades in 1981. Like most early Konami games, it was distributed by different companies worldwide, like LaJack in Japan and Stern in North America. The game was a side-scrolling shooter in a sense, although you weren't only just shooting and dodging stuff, but bombing specific fuel towers to keep your ship going, as it's endlessly running down on gas. The game is made up of 6 sections that change as you cross a certain line. There's no real stopping, it just keeps going like an endless runner until the last section where you have to take out the enemy base, and then the game goes into a loop. I used to love finding this one in the arcades. Even though I was playing it much later, around 1984-85, it was still such a blast, and what was really cool about it was that it wasn't too difficult, so one credit equaled a lot of gameplay, which is something that didn't really go together with arcades. The game was a major hit at the time, with 15,000 cabinets being sold in the US alone in its first 5 months of release. Strangely enough though, despite its popularity, it was only ported to one system officially, which was the Vectrex, but that didn't stop the clones of it popping up on many systems during the early 80s. So we're going to jump over to the Commodore 64 now, seeing as today's new game is on this system, and check out its original answer to Scramble. Like I previously said, only one official port exists originally, and what that meant is it just brought out the clones to come out on every popular system at the time. The C64 was no exception, with its handful of rip-offs coming out in the early years. For me though, the one that stands out is Scramble with a K by Anirog, which was released in 1983. Anirog were a British software company that published C64 titles from about 1983 to 85 before their eventual demise and morphing into another 8-bit company, Anko. Anirog were the kings of clone games, and if you're unfamiliar with that term, it basically means they blatantly copied popular games of the time, usually arcade games, without getting the proper licenses, and turned a quick buck with their rip-offs. Most early 8-bit companies though were all guilty of this. Just check out my documentaries on Datasoft and Synapse Software for the many examples. But with Anirog, these guys were the kings, with blatant rip-offs of Robotron, Frogger, Qbert, Donkey Kong, Moon Patrol, and of course Scramble, and that's only naming a few of them. Their version was originally released on the VIC-20 and ported to the C64, and is a pretty good facsimile of the arcade. So much so that when I was a kid I actually thought this was the official arcade port of the game. So despite them changing the ship's look, everything else is intact and follows the arcade almost beat for beat. It plays a little slower and the scrolling isn't as smooth, probably due to the VIC-20 port, but besides that it's just as much fun, and considering it was released in 1983, the graphics are really well done, and it definitely stands out for me at least as the C64's best clone of the game. Well, until our next title, that is. And now let's check out the new game. And in 2015 we got a new version of Scramble released on the Commodore 64 by Thomas Cart called Scramble V1.14. Wow. This is the first thing I said when booting this thing up for the first time. I know the arcade is pretty simplistic in retrospect, but to see such an accurate version of the arcade game on the C64 is just such a pleasure. The attention to detail is brilliant, from the recreation of the menus to the sprites looking exactly like the arcade game. Even the sound is replicated almost to a T. It's crazy good. It also plays really smoothly and is much faster and more responsive than the Anirog clone. I'm not really sure his reasoning for changing the fuel to oil and your ship therefore having an oil gauge. It doesn't really make too much sense to me to make this small change. If you're planning to sell this, I would understand, but it's a free fan-made game, so why change that? If anybody has a logical idea about this, please leave a comment. Despite this though, it's an almost perfect arcade port that feels looks and sounds almost exactly like the arcade, and is a highly recommend play on your Commodore 64. So you're probably wondering, where do I find these games? So as for the original arcade version, check out the Konami Anniversary Collection Arcade Classics. It's available on all modern systems. The Anirog version is available on eBay as a physical copy. It might be a little bit hard to find these days and might be a bit pricey. And as for the new version, it's available on csdb.dk. It's a fan-made game, so therefore it's a free download. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. If you can like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!